The music room at Ashcroft had been locked for 3 years. Cecily Vane stood inside it on a gray November morning, the key still cold in her palm, and tried to remember how to breathe. She had found it that dawn in the lesson book her father left her, tucked inside the back cover beneath a strip of green ribbon, small and iron and plain. She had not known what it opened. She had spent 4 hours learning that it opened this door. The room smelled of cold hearth ash and something sweeter underneath, some remnant of the late Duchess's rosewater that the 3 intervening winters had not entirely consumed. The curtains were half drawn, and the November light fell flat across the floor, across the covered pianoforte, across the shelves where the Duchess's music had been stored in order by season and occasion. And on the highest shelf, above the Handel and the Haydn, above the bound collections of country dances and the slim volumes of Italian songs, sat the rosewood box. It was perhaps 10 inches long and 6 inches wide. The inlaid pattern on its lid had faded from neglect. It was locked. Cecily had just reached the shelf when she heard the door behind her open. She turned. Edmund Hartwell, Marquess of Ashcroft, stood in the doorway. He was not a large man, but he occupied space in a way that other men did not. Something in the stillness of him, the careful discipline of every movement. He looked at her. He looked at the key in her hand. He looked at the rosewood box on the shelf above her head, and whatever expression had been on his face when he opened the door changed, very slightly, into something she could not name. He said nothing for a long moment. In the silence the house settled around them, a beam contracting somewhere above, the distant sound of a cart on the gravel approach. Then he said, "Miss Vane." His voice was level, unhurried. He did not ask what she was doing there. He did not ask about the key. He simply said her name and stood in the doorway and waited. She had been at Ashcroft for 7 months. She had learned in those months that the Marquess of Ashcroft was a man who waited rather than asked, and that the waiting was almost worse. "My lord," she said, and put the key into her pocket and told herself she was not afraid. He stepped into the room. He crossed to the window and pulled the curtain back 6 inches. And light fell in across the covered pianoforte, across the hearth, across the shelf where the rosewood box sat. He looked at it for a moment, with his back to her. She could not see his face. "Leave the room as you found it," he said finally, his voice the same level it always was. He left without explaining what he meant. She stood alone in the locked music room for a long moment after he had gone, the key in her pocket and the box on the shelf above her, and she thought about the tune the box played when it was opened, the tune she had heard once as a child while her father was giving his lesson, the tune she had never forgotten because of how suddenly the Duchess had risen from her chair and said, very quietly, that was enough for today. She did not know yet what the box would show her. She knew only that her father had given her the key. Her father had died a thief, according to everyone who mattered at Ashcroft. That was the word that had followed his name for 3 years, pressed into it like a seal into wax. Miss Vane, the music teacher's daughter, the one whose father stole from a dying woman and left her to die without her jewels, the one whose presence here was, by Lady Dorothea Pembroke's reckoning, a charity of the most dubious variety. Cecily had come to Ashcroft in the spring, when the post of music mistress had become available, and no other respectable situation had offered itself. She was the daughter of James Vane, who had for 12 years been the late Duchess of Ashcroft's private music teacher, and who had died in a debtor's lodging in Bath 2 years after the Duchess's death, having been dismissed without reference following accusations that had never been formally prosecuted. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, and because some part of her, the part that was still her father's daughter, had needed to be near the place where it had happened. The late Duchess had died 3 years ago in October, of what the physician called a sudden suppression of the vital functions. She had been in good health the fortnight before. She had been, as Cecily had understood it from her father's last letters, in the process of consulting a solicitor about changes to her affairs. She had been found in her own sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon, her cup of chocolate cold on the table beside her, the rosewood box open on her knee. the rosewood box that was now on the highest shelf of the locked music room. The rosewood box that had been locked and placed there the afternoon of her death by persons unknown and had remained locked ever since. Cecily thought about this as she walked back down the corridor to the wing where the children had their lessons. And she kept her face precisely as it always was, and she said nothing to anyone. It was nearly November, and the Pembrokes had been at Ashcroft for 3 weeks. Sir Gerald Pembroke was the late Duchess's younger brother, a man of 60 who wore his grey hair in the old fashion and spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told that his confidence was not warranted. He was, by the terms of the late Duchess's will, the trustee of certain entailed properties until her son produced an heir, a position that had given him both income and authority for 3 years, and which he showed no inclination to relinquish. He had brought his wife, Lady Dorothea, and his daughter, Miss Harriet Pembroke, and he had explained to Ashcroft over supper on the first night that the season was approaching, and that it would not do for the estate to remain without a mistress much longer. Lady Dorothea Pembroke was a woman who had perfected the art of wounding while appearing to console. She wore her sympathy as other women wore jewels, prominently and with great deliberateness. She had looked at Cecily on her first day at Ashcroft and said to Harriet, in a voice precisely calibrated to carry without appearing to project, "Poor creature, of course one does what one can. Though I confess I never understood how your aunt could have borne to have the music teacher's daughter underfoot." Given the circumstances, Cecily had heard it. She had been intended to hear it. Miss Harriet Pembroke was 3 years older than Cecily, and possessed of considerable beauty and considerable polish, and the serene certainty of a woman who has been told from birth that she was the correct answer to every question. She played the pianoforte adequately, and sang with a pleasant, trained voice, and she looked at Cecily with a mild, untroubled friendliness that was somehow more difficult to bear than her mother's precise cruelty. The drawing-room at Ashcroft held 35 people comfortably, and on the evenings when the Pembrokes entertained their county connections, it held somewhat more. Cecily was not among the guests. She was, on such evenings, positioned at the pianoforte to accompany Harriet's singing, a function that placed her in full view of the room while remaining entirely invisible to it. On the third such evening, she became aware that she was not entirely invisible to Lord Ashcroft. He stood near the far window with a glass he had not drunk from, and she could not have said precisely when she understood that his attention had located her, only that at some point during Harriet's second song, she had become very precisely aware of where in the room he was. The way one becomes aware of a source of warmth in a cold space without looking directly at it. She did not look at him. She played the accompaniment cleanly, and turned the pages for Harriet, when Harriet nodded, and she kept her back very straight, because that was what her posture was for. After the music, Lady Dorothea settled herself beside a Mrs. Alderton near the fireplace, and Cecily heard as she passed with the music books the words delivered in that same carrying near whisper. One does pity her, truly. Though I sometimes think it rather irregular, don't you? Having the music teacher's daughter living in the family wing, given what her father was. Cecily walked on. She did not pause. She did not look back. She went to the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand against the cold plaster of the wall until her pulse steadied, and then she went upstairs. She did not notice that Lord Ashcroft had been standing 3 feet behind Lady Dorothea, quite still, and that he had heard every word. The children Cecily taught were Ashcroft's wards, a boy of 11 named Thomas, and a girl of 8 named Clara, the orphan children of his younger brother, who had died in Spain 2 years before. Clara had taken to Cecily immediately, and, with a ferocity of attachment that Cecily found both touching and alarming. Thomas was more cautious, as boys of 11 tend to be, and showed his approval only in the form of appearing at Cecily's lessons earlier and earlier each morning, until she began to find him already at the pianoforte when she arrived, picking out tunes with one careful finger. She had been at Ashcroft for 4 months before she understood that she had. Also, without intending it, been quietly cataloguing every piece of music in the late Duchess's collection. The gallery at Ashcroft ran the full length of the east wing, hung with portraits going back 2 centuries. The late Duchess's portrait had been installed there the previous year, and Cecily had paused before it more than once, looking at the woman who had been kind to her father, the woman who had described her father in her letters as gifted and entirely trustworthy. The woman who had died before she could say those words in a room where they might have mattered. She had been in the gallery one November evening, very late, replacing a damaged page in one of the Duchess's music folios that she had quietly been repairing. The folio was old and much used, and several pages had come loose from the binding, and Cecily had spent an evening carefully restoring them, working at the small desk near the window by candlelight, not because anyone had asked her to, but because they had been the Duchess's, and they were beautiful, and they were being lost. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a boot heel on the gallery floor. Then silence. Then she understood that he had stopped. She did not immediately look up. She pressed the last repaired page carefully back into the folio and set the small weight on it to dry. Then she looked up. Lord Ashcroft stood at the edge of the candlelight, perhaps 10 feet away. He had not announced himself. He was still in his evening coat, and the candle threw the shadow of him long across the gallery floor, back toward the portraits. He was looking at what she had been doing. He looked at her for a moment. She could not tell what he was thinking. Then he said, "That is my mother's hand." "On those pages?" "Yes," she said. "Several had come loose. I thought they ought to be preserved." He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the folio, and at the careful repair she had made, and at the small weight she had placed to hold the page while it dried. Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. "She was fond of your father," he said. It was not the sort of thing anyone else at Ashcroft had said to her. "He was fond of her," Cecily said. "He said she played with great natural feeling. He said she always knew when a piece wanted to go slowly, even when the notation said otherwise." Lord Ashcroft was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes," in a voice that was very low, and turned, and walked back down the gallery toward the house. She sat alone with the candlelight for a long moment after he had gone, the repaired folio before her, and she pressed her hand flat against the cover, and she thought about the rosewood box, and the key in her pocket, and the tune. She would have to find out what the tune meant. She understood, that night in the gallery, that she had already decided. The following Tuesday, Lord Ashcroft did not appear at dinner. Sir Gerald presided at the table's head, with the comfortable authority of a man who has occupied a seat so long he has forgotten it belongs to someone else. He spoke at some length about the estate's northern holdings, about the advantages of certain improvements he had been considering, about the season approaching, and the sense he had formed that Ashcroft required more regular society than it had been keeping. "It is a fine estate," Sir Gerald said, addressing the table generally in the tone of someone who expects to be agreed with. "And it has been kept too much in shadow. The late Duchess would have said so, I am certain. She always maintained that Ashcroft ought to be at the center of the county's life." He paused and looked down the table toward Cecily, who sat at its far end, as befitted her station, and his expression registered her presence the way a man registers an object left on a chair. "I trust the children are progressing with their music, Miss Vane. My sister was very particular about the musical education here." "They are progressing well, Sir Gerald," she said. He nodded, the nod of a man who considers the matter settled. "Good. Though I confess I have sometimes wondered whether the arrangement is quite the right one. A music teacher's daughter, as a governess. One wants someone with a certain establishment behind her for the sake of the children's formation." He glanced at Lady Dorothea. Lady Dorothea smiled with great warmth at her wine-glass. No aspersion intended, of course. "One simply wonders what my sister was thinking." In the circumstances, the table was silent in the particular way that tables are silent, when something has been said that everyone heard and no one will acknowledge. Cecily said evenly, "Lady Ashcroft was a woman of considerable discernment, Sir Gerald. I believe her thinking was usually sound. It was not quite an impertinence. It was not quite not one either." Sir Gerald looked at her for a moment, with a flat attention she had not seen on his face before. Then he smiled, the same wide social smile he had worn the entire evening, and said, "Indeed she was," and turned back to Harriet, and the moment passed. But it had happened. She held it inside her like a coal. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her room in the East Wing and thought about the Duchess, about the solicitor's visit her father had described in his last coherent letter, about the music box and the key and the tune she had been hearing in her head since childhood, and at 2 o'clock in the morning she put on her wrapper and her shoes and she went down to the music room. She used the key. The rosewood box sat on the highest shelf, exactly as it had been. She lifted it down carefully and set it on the covered pianoforte and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than she had expected. The lock was small and precise, and the key fit without resistance. When she lifted the lid, the mechanism engaged, and the tune began. It was a simple air. 8 bars, repeated twice. The notes were bright and unhurried in the cold room, and she stood with her hands around the box and listened to them. And she was 8 years old again, sitting on the bench in the corner while her father played through the Duchess's lesson. And the Duchess had opened this same box, and the tune had played, and the Duchess had said that that was enough for today, in a voice that had something in it Cecily had not understood. Then she understood it now. The voice had been frightened. Inside the lid, fitted into the velvet lining above the mechanism, was a small folded paper. She had not seen it immediately, because it lay flat against the velvet, tucked under a narrow gilt border. She unfolded it with fingers that did not shake, though she was aware they wanted to. The Duchess's handwriting. She had seen enough of it, in the margins of the music folios, to know it at once. 3 lines. A date 3 years ago, 1 week before her death. A single sentence, in her careful hand. I have made my intention known to Mr. Finch, and Gerald knows it, and he will not let me sign. And a name written last, alone on its own line, the way one writes a name when one wants it to be remembered. Gerald Pembroke. Cecily stood in the cold music room with the paper in her hands, and let herself understand what she was holding. She had come to Ashcroft looking for her father's innocence. She had found something larger and more terrible, and she did not yet know what to do with it. She did not sleep that night. She folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the lesson book where she had found the key, and she put the key in her pocket, and she locked the music box and returned it to the shelf and relocked the music room door, and she went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed until the light came up outside the window, gray and insufficient. There was only one thing to do. She had known it since she had read the paper. She simply had not been ready to know it yet. She would have to tell Lord Ashcroft. She found him the next morning, in the study. He was standing at the window with a letter in his hand, and when she knocked and he said to enter, and she came through the door and closed it behind her, and said that she had something to tell him, and it was not simple. Something moved across his face, a kind of bracing, a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. She told him everything. She told him about the key and where she had found it, and what it opened. She told him about the paper inside the box. She told him what the paper said. She watched his face as she spoke, and she saw the moment when he understood, and she did not look away from it. He said nothing for a long time after she had finished. He had set the letter down very precisely on the desk at some point during her account, and his hands were loose at his sides, and he was looking out the window at the gray November grounds, at the frost-silvered lawn, at nothing she could see. Then he said, "You are certain it is her hand?" "I am certain," she said. "And where is the paper now?" "In my room, locked inside the lesson book." He turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not fully read, something between grief and a precise, contained fury that was quieter than anger and somehow more serious. He said, "Thank you, Miss Vane." Then, "Do not tell anyone else. Do not show the paper to anyone in this house. Do you understand me?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. He turned back to the window. She understood she was dismissed. She went to the door and had her hand on the handle when he spoke again, without turning around. "Your father," he said. "Did he know what was in the box?" She was still for a moment. "He knew what the tune was called," she said. "He mentioned it in a letter once. He said it was called Pembroke's Folly. An old family air." She heard him draw a breath. Then he said, "Yes," and that was all. She went out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and let herself feel very briefly the relief of having said it. She had done what she could do. Whatever happened next was in hands larger than hers. What happened next was not what she had trusted would happen. That same afternoon, Sir Gerald presented himself at the door of her sitting room and asked very pleasantly to speak with her for a moment. He came in without waiting for her to agree, and closed the door behind him and stood in the center of the room and looked at her with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely without warmth. He said that he understood she had been spending some time in rooms that were not her province. He said that he had great regard for her father's memory, such as it was, but that he could not help observing that the apple did not fall far from the tree, and that women in service who involved themselves in matters above their station generally found that their situations became very precarious. He said all of this in the same tone he used at dinner when discussing the estate accounts. Then he said that he trusted she understood him. She said very precisely that she understood him perfectly. He smiled, the wide social smile, and left. She sat very still for a long time after he had gone. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was arranged. Inside her chest something cold had settled. The specific cold of someone who has been warned by the person who did the thing and who knows now that there is no one in this house who will step between them. That evening she passed Mrs. Jelly Holt in the kitchen passage, the old housekeeper who had been at Ashcroft since before the Duchess's marriage. Mrs. Holt put a hand on her arm, lightly, and said very low, "You ought to know, Miss Vane, what they are saying in the hall. That you have been going into rooms that don't concern you. That you have been putting ideas in his lordship's head, as your father put ideas in her ladyship's head, and that the music teacher's daughter has no more sense of her place than her father did." She paused. "I thought you ought to know." Her eyes were very steady. "I also thought you ought to know that I was the one who let your father into this house the morning he came to say goodbye to her, and that he wept, Miss Vane, when they told him what they were saying he had done. I have not forgotten it." Cecily thanked her. She went upstairs. Lord Ashcroft did not come to dinner that night. He did not appear the following morning. She heard through Clara, who heard everything, that he had ridden out early and was not expected until evening. She sat with this for one full day. She thought about his pleasant voice, and his warning, and the paper in the lesson book, and the solicitor named Mr. Finch, who had been mentioned in the Duchess's handwriting. She thought about her father's face, which she could still see precisely if she closed her eyes. A face that had spent its last years learning to hold the expression of a man who has been tried and found guilty of something he did not do. She thought about 3 years of that expression and the debtor's lodging in Bath, and the absence of a reference, and the cold. Then she put on her second-best coat and her warmest gloves, and she walked the 2 miles to the village, and she found the solicitor's office, and she went in. Mr. Finch was a small, spare man of late middle age, who wore his hair in the old style, and who looked at her over his spectacles with an expression of concentrated attention when she told him her name. He said, "Vane." He said it again, quietly, as if testing it. Then he said, "Your father's daughter." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been waiting 3 years for someone from Ashcroft to come through that door. I confess I had not expected it to be you." He took her into his private room, and he told her about the sealed codicil. The Duchess had entrusted it to him 6 days before she died, a letter addressed to her son, sealed with the Ashcroft crest, with instructions that it was to be delivered to him in the event of her sudden or unexpected death, and not before. Mr. Finch had written to Ashcroft twice in the 3 years since her death. He had received, on each occasion, a reply from Sir Gerald's secretary, indicating that the estate was not presently in a position to receive correspondence of a personal nature. The letters had never reached Lord Ashcroft. Cecily produced the paper from the lesson book and laid it on Mr. Finch's desk. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and set it beside the codicil, which he had taken from his strong-box, and he looked at both of them together for a long moment. "I will need to deliver this myself," he said. "Today, if you are willing."
"I am willing,"
she said. She did not have to walk back. Mr. Finch had a gig. The drawing-room at Ashcroft was full that evening, as it had been almost every evening since the Pembrokes' arrival. Sir Gerald sat near the fireplace. Lady Dorothea sat beside him with Harriet arranged gracefully at her left, her cream silk gown catching the candlelight. Several county families were present. The Aldertons and the Morrises and old General Payne, who had known the late Duchess's father and who sat in the corner nearest the fire, and said little. Lord Ashcroft was standing at the far end of the room near the terrace doors. When Cecily entered with Mr. Finch, she saw his gaze go to the solicitor first, and then to her, and she saw the moment when he understood that she had not waited. Something moved across his face, very briefly, that was not anger. Mr. Finch presented himself to Lord Ashcroft with the formal courtesy of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is glad to set it down. He presented the sealed codicil. He said quietly that it was the late Duchess's instruction that it be read in the presence of any interested parties. He looked at Sir Gerald when he said this, and Sir Gerald looked back at him with the blank, smooth confidence of a man who does not yet understand that the ground has moved. Lord Ashcroft broke the seal. The room had quieted without being asked to. This was perhaps the most Regency thing about the moment, Cecily thought later. An English room could hear a change in register and fall silent by instinct. The social machinery adjusted itself to ceremony when ceremony was required. He read it in silence first. The reading took perhaps 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, Cecily watched Sir Gerald's face, and she watched Lady Dorothea's face, and she saw on Sir Gerald's face, in the 6th of the 3 minutes, the precise moment when he understood that something had gone wrong. Lord Ashcroft looked up from the letter. He looked at Sir Gerald for a moment. Then he read it aloud. The late Duchess had written in a clear, unhurried hand. She had written that she had reason to believe her brother Gerald intended to prevent her from signing a new instrument that would have revised the terms of the trusteeship and placed her son in full control of the estate immediately upon her death. She had written that she had spoken to her brother directly, and that he had said certain things to her which she would not repeat, but which she considered to constitute a threat. She had written that she did not think her health was in danger, but that she was not certain. She had written that if anything happened to her before she could sign, her son was to know that James Vane, her music teacher, was entirely trustworthy, had acted, always, with perfect honesty in her service, and was to be treated accordingly. She had written that the rosewood box in her music room contained a paper she had placed there for his finding, and that the key was with Mr. Vane. She had written that she loved her son, and that she was sorry for their quarrel and that she hoped he would not carry it long. The room was very quiet. General Payne said from his corner near the fire, "Good God!" Sir Gerald had not moved. He was sitting exactly as he had been sitting at the beginning of the evening, but the expression on his face had changed entirely. It was not the collapse of a villain. It was the collapse of a man whose entire architecture had rested on a single assumption, and the assumption had just been removed. He looked, briefly, like someone who had forgotten where he was. Lady Dorothea had gone very still. Harriet had gone pale. Lord Ashcroft set the letter down on the mantelpiece. He turned from the fireplace. He crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly, or dramatically, or with any apparent haste. He walked as he always walked, deliberate and contained. And the room parted for him, as rooms do for men who occupy space that way. He stopped in front of Cecily. He said, "Miss Vane is under my protection, and Pembroke is not." 12 words. He said them in the same level voice he used for everything, and they fell into the silence of the drawing-room, and did not echo, simply sat there, clear and irrevocable. She was aware, distantly, of the room's collective breath. She was aware of Sir Gerald not speaking. She was aware of Lady Dorothea's fan, which had been moving very slightly and which had stopped. She was aware of General Payne saying something to the gentleman beside him, quietly, and that something being very firmly approving. She looked at Lord Ashcroft. She had held herself very carefully for 7 months, held herself against everything that had been said and implied and suggested and threatened, held herself the way her father had taught her to hold herself, with her back straight and her face arranged. She held herself now. She said, "Thank you, my lord." He looked at her. His face was, as it always was, composed. There was something behind it that she could not entirely name. Then he said no, very quietly, in a voice that was not for the room. "Thank you, Mr. Plecht." Finch engaged in a brief, formal exchange with Sir Gerald that involved the words trusteeship and dissolution and immediate accounting in a tone that left no room for equivocation. Sir Gerald replied in a voice that was no longer the pleasant dinner-table voice. It was smaller and flatter, and it had lost its certainty, the way a voice does when the certainty that produced it has been publicly removed. He left the drawing-room shortly afterward, followed by Lady Dorothea and Harriet, and the remaining company rearranged itself in the quiet, decisive way of a room that has witnessed something and has collectively decided what to think of it. General Payne, on his way out, took Cecily's hand in both of his and said simply, "Your father was a good man, Miss Vane." "I am glad to hear it," said she. Thanked him. She meant it. She did not sleep well that night, for the second time in a week, but for entirely different reasons. The music room was opened the following morning by Lord Ashcroft's instruction. The curtains were drawn back. The hearth was laid and lit. The covering was taken from the pianoforte, the old ivory keys exposed to the November light. He brought her there at mid-morning, when the house was quiet, and the children had been let out into the frost-touched garden, with their coats and scarves. He carried the rosewood box himself, from the high shelf, and set it on the lid of the pianoforte, and he placed the key beside it without speaking. She picked up the key. Her hands were very steady. She opened the box, and the mechanism engaged, and the tune played. Wah, 8 bars, unhurried, the notes perfectly calibrated by whoever had built the box. Clear and even and slightly melancholy, the way old family airs tend to be, carrying something in them, of the houses they belonged to, the families that had passed the melody down until it arrived at this room, on this morning, with the frost outside and the fire just beginning to catch. She listened to it. She let herself listen to all 8 bars, and the repeat. Then she sat down at the pianoforte. She played the tune again from memory, exactly as the box had played it, and then she played it again, and she let it unwind from its 8 bars into something slightly longer, the way tunes sometimes want to go, the natural extension of a phrase that wants an answer. Her father had taught her that every melody was a question. He had taught her to find the answer. Lord Ashcroft stood beside the pianoforte, not leaning, not posed, simply standing the way he stood, with his hands loose at his sides and his face very still. He was looking at her hands on the keys. She was aware of him with the whole of her, the warmth of him beside her in the cold room, the sound of his breathing, the particular quality of his attention that she had been aware of for months and had not let herself name. She played through the answering phrase once. Then she stopped, her hands resting on the keys. She said, without turning, "My lord." "When you read your mother's letter." The part about the quarrel. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Did it help? To know that she meant it to reach you?" Another silence, longer. She felt him shift slightly, something that was almost as settling, as if he had been braced for something and had let the brace go. "Yes," he said. His voice was very low. "It helped more than I expected." She nodded. She looked at her hands on the keys, the worn ivory, the slight yellowing at the edges, the keys that the Duchess had played and that Cecily's father had played beside her, and that now were Cecily's to play, on this November morning, with the fire catching behind them, and the rosewood box open on the lid above her. She said, "My father would have been glad she wrote it." "I believe," he said, and paused. The way he paused. That deliberate space before he said something that mattered. "That she would have been glad to know you opened the box." She turned and looked at him. He was very close, standing beside the instrument the way he had been. His face was the face she had been learning for 7 months, the particular set of it, the jaw, the gray-blue eyes, the way a thing moved behind it that he did not often let reach the surface. She could see it now, more clearly than she had before. She did not look away. He did not look away either. After a moment, he said, "You walked to the village alone." "In November." "Yes," she said. "You did not wait for me." He looked at her. Something that might have been in a man with a less careful face, the beginning of a smile, passed across his eyes. "I find," he said, "that I am not as displeased by that as I might have expected to be." She said, "I could not wait." "No," he said, "I think you could not." He looked at the open box. He looked at her. He said very quietly, her first name, "Cecily." Said it the way one says a name one has been holding carefully for some time, and has decided to finally set down in the open. Her breath caught. She was very still. He put out his hand, palm up, between them, the gesture unhurried and precisely weighted, the same economy he brought to everything. An invitation, not a command. She understood the difference. She placed her hand in his. The fire was fully caught behind them now, and the frost was still on the garden outside the window, and the rosewood box sat open on the pianoforte lid, with the mechanism stilled and the paper gone to Mr. Sean. Finch's keeping and the velvet lining empty and faded and entirely itself. She felt the warmth of his hand around hers. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific sensation of being held with someone else's certainty. That spring the music room remained open. Clara had claimed it on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and Thomas had begun to use it in the early mornings, working through his scales with the steadiness of someone who had decided to take a thing seriously. The rosewood box had been placed on the mantelpiece, the lid resting open, the mechanism visible, the tune available to anyone who cared to listen. Mrs. Holt had polished it herself, and it shone in the firelight in the evenings in a way it had not shone in years. Mr. Secker. Finch had completed the transfer of the trusteeship by February, with a thoroughness that reflected 3 years of careful preparation. Sir Gerald had returned to his own estate in Somerset, and Lady Dorothea had written a letter to Ashcroft that was addressed, notably, to the Marchioness of Ashcroft, in an uncertain hand. Harriet had gone to Bath for the season and had been reported by the following April to be engaged to a perfectly suitable clergyman in Wiltshire, a match that seemed to suit her very well. Cecily had wished her genuinely well and meant it. Her father's name had been restored through the same instrument that had removed it, quietly and without fanfare, a correction rather than a ceremony. She had not attended any official proceeding. She had sat in the music room the morning the papers were signed and played the melody through once, the 8 bars and the repeat and the answer she had found for it, and she had let herself feel what she felt, which was grief and gratitude and the particular piece of a thing finally said right. And she had let it sit in the room for a moment before she let it go. In the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she sometimes sat at the pianoforte and played nothing in particular, following whatever the keys wanted to do. He would come sometimes and sit in the chair near the fire and read or do nothing, simply be in the same room in the way that he was, in rooms that particular occupied stillness. She had learned, in the months since November, that this was one of the ways he showed what he valued, not by speaking it, but by being present, reliably, and without fanfare in the same space as the thing he valued. She did not require it. Said she was glad sometimes that it was said anyway. The last snow of the season came in March, a light snow that began before dawn and covered the grounds in a thin white silence by the time the household woke. She found him at the window of the music room in the early morning, before the children were up, watching the snow come down on the frost-gray garden. He heard her come in and did not turn immediately. Then he did. She crossed the room. She stood beside him at the window and looked out at the snow, at the grounds going white, at the stone urns on the terrace wearing their new inch of white each, at the silence of it. He reached over and took her hand. The same unhurried gesture, no announcement required. The rosewood box sat open on the mantelpiece behind them, its velvet lining empty and its mechanism quiet, waiting for someone to wind it. The fire was warm. Outside, the snow came down in slow, particular flakes, each one landing and holding for a moment before it was joined by the next, the way small things accumulate into something that changes the whole shape of the ground. She thought of her father's hands on the keys, and of the Duchess's voice saying that that was enough for today, and of the tune that had been waiting for 3 years in a locked box for someone to hear what it was trying to say. It had been heard, it had been answered. The box was open, and the ground was covered in new snow, and she was here. If something in Cecily's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know. She had waited long enough for that.